This covenant is older than your entire HOA. The law is on our side.
They nailed the eviction notice to my front door at dawn like a crooked medal, and the sheriff, his badge half hidden under a flannel, smiled as if he'd done me a favor. I held the paper under my thumb, felt the damp from last night's rain seep into the fibers, and laughed once, low and tired, because laughter is a cheap kind of defiance, and I needed something cheap that morning. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far HOA power reaches. The HOA president stood on my porch in a suit that had never seen a lawnmower, his cufflinks catching the wet light. Richard Marlowe, 58, hair like a comb, had visited it twice a week. Skin the color of old bourbon, a smile that narrowed like a noose when he spoke of rules. He smelled of lemon oil and cheap aftershave, the sort of man who keeps a ledger of small cruelties. He handed the sheriff a stack of papers and tapped the top one with a manicured nail. "We followed protocol," he said. The word protocol tasted like metal in my mouth. I thought about the dam before I thought about lawyers. There is a downstream culvert behind my property, an earthen berm my grandfather taught me to care for, half maligned but full of memory. The dam wasn't dramatic, just a rusted sluice gate, and a chain I kept oil slick and tended like a wound. I had been a firefighter for 12 years and then town archivist for 5, so I knew the smell of smoke and the smell of paper. I knew how small things fail and how water makes liars tell the truth. Flashback 23 days. The first truck rolled down my gravel road like a rumor. A white dump with a company name I didn't know. Its engine coughed and the driver had his hat pulled low. I watched from the kitchen window. The sun struck the truck's flank and threw a hot glare. The town was supposed to be small enough that every new foundation got someone's attention. But the developer's permits were stamped, rapid and neat, and the planning board had apparently passed something in a midnight meeting, minutes filed under a clerk's shaky handwriting. That was Incident 1. Foundations poured where my meadow used to be. The dirt smelled of oil and new concrete. The taste of dust on my tongue felt like a premonition. They built 50 homes. 50. They put up fences where my apple trees used to cast shade. They ran new water lines trenched through old drainage and left orange flags like wounds across my property. I walked those flags barefoot one night after work and felt the reprieve of cold dirt between my toes. Sound, geese far off, pipes clanking in the new trenches. Touch, wire prick, and the rough rope of my grandfather's well cover. Sight, the glowing eyes of security lights on the new houses, like stars fallen too low. At the HOA meeting that followed, Richard wore an expression like a man who has mastered a private joke. He slammed a gavel, a short, decisive sound that looked better in his social media photos than it felt in the cramped room, and declared the new development a community enhancement. The gavel echoed off the plaster and into my jaw. The room smelled of coffee and paper and a nervous kind of old money. People around me murmured assent because fear is often louder than outrage in a small town. They called my protest procedural. They called my maps outdated. They called my grandfather a non-resident stakeholder. They sent me the first fine, $75 for unauthorized obstruction, because I had placed a sign at the property line that read, "Private land, no trespassing." The paper felt like a knife. I paid and then refused to pay the second. Monday fines, Tuesday threats, Wednesday sabotage. A montage of bad faith. I found the first wrinkle in their story inside a salted envelope from the county archives. As town archivist, I had keys and a face that the clerks trusted. Trust is leverage, and I used it. The envelope contained a survey from 1905, a covenant stamped by hands long bone dry. My grandfather's name was on it. Ink bled into the paper, like dried blood. The boundary lines were clear as grammar. I ran my thumb across the map and tasted the paper again, older and calmer, like chewing on someone else's life. That was where the first knowledge hit me. The thin little legal fact I shouldn't have had to know, but did. Recorded covenants and CC&Rs, conditions, covenants, and restrictions, are the binding law of the land for homeowners and HOAs. Any expansion of common areas or change in use typically requires a properly recorded amendment, not a whisper in a room with pastries. That fact was a match in a tinderbox. I tucked the survey under my jacket like contraband, and for the first time, in months, felt the arc of a plan. They responded to the survey with surveillance. A camera mounted on a telephone pole like a metallic bird blinked red at dusk. My mailbox was split one morning, the notch of a crowbar, a paper scattered like wounded wings. Someone left a printed flyer on my door that called me an obstacle to progress. Progress smelled of paint thinner and arrogance. The town council, friends from decades, began avoiding me like a rumor. When you've been a firefighter, you read smoke differently. You learn to look at the way a little heat runs up a wall, the way a tiny crack becomes an exit. My time pulling. People from houses that had betrayed them taught me an odd but useful patience with escalation. I can spot the choke points, permits, recorded minutes, signatures. I read files like char, and I began to map their lies. At the second HOA meeting, I walked in with a little more than a map. I walked in with 3 allies who looked like they belonged to the wrong decade. Maria, a civil engineer who could make a culvert sing back into compliance. Baxter, a retired surveyor with hands like flat stones and a temper that was small but consistent. And Lila, my neighbor who could bake an apple pie that reminded you of church and truth. We sat, and we watched as Richard posed for his cameras and recited talking points. He had habits, a little cough when he lied, the way he folded his hands in the same pattern when he'd crafted a narrative. Knowing those patterns felt like knowing where his fracture points might be. They accused me of harassment. Someone from the HOA left 12 pages of accusations slid under my door at midnight. Someone cut a length of hose attached to my rein. Barrels and spilled water into the ditch like an accusation. The smell of wet grass stung like betrayal. I found myself speaking to the camera crews invited by a local blogger. When people who are supposed to steward a community instead collude to build illegal structures on private land, that's not stewardship. That's corruption, I said into a microphone that tasted like metal. Midnight phone calls started. A man claimed to be from zoning, asking for clarification on property lines. He didn't sound like any public servant I knew. The next morning, a bulldozer knocked through a hedgerow that had stood since my grandmother's time. I sank my hands into the shattered roots and felt the dry give of old soil. There is a physical grief in seeing something you love turned into noise and dust. My father used to say, "You don't fight a man at his worst if you want to win. You fight him at his proof." That night, I stayed at my desk until my eyes blurred, and my mouth tasted of coffee. I pulled property ledgers, cross-referenced mortgage transfers, scanned for recorded amendments. The documents had the right stamps, but the wrong story. A developer's affidavit claimed a transfer of an easement signed by someone with my grandfather's name, but the signature sloped differently, decisive in places my grandfather's hand would not be. Forensics is a glittering word for patience. I printed and enlarged and compared fibers and ink. The smell of toner, the crinkle of thermal paper. These were the smells of a war staged in offices. We put the signature next to the survey, and the difference was a small geometry that felt like a treachery. Maria said, "This could be criminal." Baxter said, "This looks like someone bought a clerk." Lila cried in a kitchen I had once painted for her, and then baked me a pie, because that was what she did when the world wanted to fall apart. Her pie tasted like rebellion. By the time I walked into that third meeting, I had more than pie and a map. I had a recorded phone call. You can get people to talk if you ask the right questions, if you let them hear themselves brag. A junior clerk at the permit office, nervous, quick to please, had let slip that a stack of minutes had been filed after the fact. A public record altered to fit a narrative. The sensation when the clerk's voice said, "We just filed them to match what happened," was like someone turning a screwdriver in your ribs. That moment, the sound, the taste of coffee curdled, was a spear. At the meeting, Richard smirked and then tried to smooth the water with platitudes, but his voice had a burr when the clerk was mentioned. He slammed his gavel once, twice. The room's light had a thinness to it like an old film. I asked a question, and he answered with a smile and the smell of lemon oil again. The camera zoomed. I felt like I was watching myself from 14 rows back. "If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending," I said to myself out loud, the pre-CTA humor of a man used to needing other people's voices to make his point heard. The second knowledge hit, at T, the moment they pushed their legal muscle. HOAs operate under state law and the recorded governing documents, but they do not have carte blanche to rewrite those documents alone. Most states require a recorded amendment or a supermajority vote among homeowners, often with strict notice requirements. Also, fines and enforcement must follow the association's published enforcement policy. Arbitrary, punitive fines without notice or a hearing can be challenged in court. I set it into the room like a diagnosis. The plaintiff's file is built from procedure. If an association skips procedure, they make evidence for you. They change tactics. If the paperwork couldn't be used to hide the build, they'd use people. They hired a PR firm that smelled like citrus and spin. They sent letters to neighbors, accusing me of creating unrest. A woman who had once borrowed sugar from my pantry handed me a flyer calling me a troublemaker. I felt the town turning its face, as if there were some shame in being the only one asking an obvious question. Where did those 50 houses come from, and who signed for them? The building site went on. Lights at night, men with headlamps threading, pipes through the dark. I walked the edge of it and found, half buried, a stamped permit with an embossed seal, except the seal didn't match any county seal I'd seen. The taste of metal in my mouth came back. I wrapped the permit in wax paper and kept it like a talisman. That was the thumbnail-worthy moment I wanted on a screen. The camera catches me pulling out a permit that shouldn't exist, my hand steady, Richard's jaw tightening off stage. The visual is simple and perfect for a single-frame thumbnail. My hand, the fake seal, his face when he realizes someone else knows. The town attorney sent a letter. It used words like non-compliance and summary abatement, and it smelled of old libraries and defensive lawyers. I put the letter in a drawer and drew a line under certain phrases. Summary abatement sounded like a bulldozer to me. The sentence where they threatened immediate action that would have displaced families living in the new homes, sat like a red bead on a map. If they could move families with paperwork, they could move a town with pronouncements. Someone I thought was an ally, a man who had laughed with me over beers and called me by my grandfather's name, who had keys to the very clerk's office, asked me quietly if I would consider a compromise. His manner was casual. The room smelled of his cheap cologne. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a copy of a signed deed, and for a moment I thought I saw the shape of mercy. Then he said, "It'll be easier for everyone if we just agree to a small easement." His hand trembled as he pushed the paper across the table. I put my thumb on the ink and felt an old man's hand in the stroke. My grandfather's pressure was different. Betrayal is a small, sharp thing. I left the meeting with the taste of pie gone and the taste of iron in my mouth. I drove to the dam and stood with my palms on the cold chain. The sluice gate had a film of rust that flaked onto my gloves. The air smelled of river mud, and the town over the hill hummed like a living thing not yet awake. I thought about the sheriff at my door, the eviction notice, and the smug look on Richard's face. I thought about laws that read like iron, and people who thought themselves the Smiths. There is a particular kind of silence right before things change. The wind held its breath. I felt the weight of being the only one who had seen the map and the fake seal and the altered minutes. I thought of the knowledge in my pocket, the 1905 covenant, the forged signature, the stamped but fake permit, and the one thing that always makes power taste less certain: proof. That night, I turned the rusted chain once, twice, and then pulled it free. The sluice gate groaned like a sleeping animal roused, and a thin ribbon of water began to move. The sound changed the color of the night. As water that had been held, back found its mouth. It hummed with potential, the same way a match hums in the dark. I didn't open it to drown the meeting or to be theatrical. I opened it because water remembers its own course, because when you let it run, you see what resists and what yields. The smell of wet earth rose, and the silence broke into a low, distant roar. Back on my porch, before the sun came up, there was a knock I didn't want. The sheriff's boots were heavy with the morning. The eviction notice still clung to the door, soggy at the corners. The sheriff's voice was professional, but his eyes danced when he looked at Richard. Richard's face was a brief anatomy of triumph, and then, suddenly, doubt, a shard of something like fear. In his hand, the gavel seemed suddenly fragile. I folded my hands and held the damn chain like a rosary and knew, with a clarity that felt like a verdict, that this was not just my fight. This was a takedown in slow motion. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love what happens next. Stick with me. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. I thought of the survey again. The survey that would, if placed on a table in the right courtroom, make their plans look like the hurried, petty things they were. I thought of the forged affidavit and of a clerk whose conscience passed for sale. I thought of Richard's habits, his cough when he lied, the way he polished his cufflinks between paragraphs. I thought of how the town would look when the truth was a river and not a rumor. The night the chain went slack and water began to move, something shifted in the town, too. You could feel it in the way the light over the construction site thinned. You could feel it in the way a camera that had been trained on me for weeks finally turned its lens elsewhere, uncertain. The first act ends with a door not yet closed. A sheriff, a forged deed, a sluice gate, and the taste of iron still in my mouth. The chain around the gate is old but not unbreakable, and the papers in my jacket are dangerous if read in the right light. The final question hangs. When the water meets the meeting, who will drown and who will be washed clean? They came at dawn with more than trucks this time. They came with lawyers and laminated excuses, with a local reporter's notepad and a PR email that smelled of antiseptic. The town felt smaller that week, like a shirt I'd been wearing too long. When they parked their shiny SUVs along the shoulder, the sun came up and struck the chrome like a judge's gavel. The developer's foreman tipped his hard hat at me the way a man tips an unsteady hat to a storm. I wondered briefly if storms made better allies than people. Reports started to appear online. A small blog with a banner that said, "Community First" published a puff piece about neighborhood growth. It called the new houses a necessary evolution. I read it with the same thin, cold amusement you reserve for a magician's patter while he palms a card. The smell of printer ink, the click of my keyboard, the taste of stale coffee. All of it felt like preparation for the thing that was coming. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The HOA accelerated its timeline like a man trying to outrun an accusation. Fines multiplied. Letters came in envelopes that had been creased and kissed by someone's thumb. They were formal and unkind. Each one had the same header, notice of. Violation. The penalties accrued like interest. They wanted me to fold. They wanted everyone to see me fold. They pushed neighbors, too. A man named Harold, who sold me eggs in winter, received a certified letter declaring his nonconformity because his chicken coop sat 3 feet too close to a property line. The letter read like a menu of humiliation. Harold came to my porch with a paper cup of coffee gone cold and handed it to me as if to show he still believed in the small courtesies of life. The smell of burnt grounds rose between us, and he said, "They told me if I don't comply, my house could be fined." The look on his face was not the look of a man who wanted war. It was the look of a man who wanted to keep his eggs. We organized like people who had discovered their voices had the right pitch for a choir. Maria set to work mapping easements and water lines, the way a surgeon sketches an incision. She smelled of motor oil and determination. Her fingers were always stained with grease. Baxter dusted off his old theodolite, adjusted its eye like a man taking aim at truth. Lila made flyers and put them on porches, her handwriting tidy and urgent. The community started to hum. The sound was small, but honest. Children playing in yards that weren't yet plastered with notices, dogs barking, a radio playing an old country song. We filed for discovery, for records. We knocked on the county clerk's door until the clerk let us in and sighed like a man carrying more secrets than he could swallow. I can't tell you how many times the phrase, "We don't have that on file," was used like a weapon. But we had the 1905 covenant and the forged signature and the stamped permit that didn't match. We had the junior clerk who'd admitted filing minutes after the fact. That admission was a thin thread, but the kind of thread that, when pulled, can unravel a sweater. Here's a fact. Many HOAs rely on the trust of procedural formality. If they skip required notice or fabricate a vote, they create a paper trail that is, by legal standards, fragile and contestable. Most states require that homeowners be given notice and an opportunity to be heard before fines become enforceable. The tight clinical truth is this: when an association fails to follow its own notice and hearing procedures, a court can deem the enforcement action void. I said this out loud in a room filled with coffee and county noise and watched some heads tilt, because when you say the name of a weakness, it becomes a strategy. We went on the offensive in ways that made them flinch. Maria found an easement that ran through the heart of the new development, not for water but for a carriage path. Recorded in 1912 that no one had thought to use in a century. Old carriage paths are like anachronisms with teeth. They bind present uses to past agreements. We dug into old ledgers and pulled up affidavits and photocopies that smelled like mothballs and history. The developers' counsel swung back, legal, jargon like a bludgeon. They hired a private investigator who took pictures of me pulling weeds and called it hostile intent. The investigator's flash made me feel like an exhibit. There was a pattern to Richard's cruelty. He loved ceremonies and small punishments. He loved sending letters with a kind of perfunctory cruelty. Please correct this by the 15th, because deadlines are a way to eat someone's time. But in the quiet hours between his proclamations, he had a tremor in his left hand. My ears caught it on video. A small, involuntary quiver when he tried to keep his smile even. Maria noticed that his ledger entries included large transfers to an entity that, when traced, led to a mortgage company with ties to the developer. People have vices that match their crimes. Richard's was an old house with too many unpaid taxes. He needed the development to pay for his debts. A vulnerability any prosecutor would like. The vulnerability was gold. It explained a lot of the zealotry. It explained why he'd be willing to lever the HOA like a crowbar. It explained why he lied so often. When you're trying to mask debts, you build narratives and hope they solidify. It's one thing to bully neighbors. It's another thing to spend the community's moral capital to settle a private debt. The smell of lemon oil clung to his suit like perfume on a dead note. Our media strategy was basic and mean. Truth, as loud as possible. Lila wrote an op-ed about small-town power and the smell of damp paper and the taste of iron when an eviction notice arrives at dawn. A local radio host interviewed me live. His voice was rough and warm. I told him about forged permits and altered minutes and the bulldozer that took Mrs. Yates's lilac hedge. When you tell a story in a voice people recognize, they lean in. When you tell a story about place, about the smell of lilacs, the sound of a sluice gate, people respond. The segment trended inside our county like a storm front. Midway through the battle, we set a trap. We sent a single, carefully worded FOIA request to the county for all communications between the HOA and the developer in the 6 months before construction began. The smell of paper came back to me like an old friend as their email servers coughed up chains of messages. There it was, an email thread where someone from the developer asked about expediting permits, and a clerk replied, "We'll make it happen." The thread was raw and rich. It tasted like vindication. We had the digital signature of collusion. Here's another fact, and it's important. Forged permits and altered public records can be criminal, not just civil. A falsified county stamp or an altered minutes document used to justify construction is evidence of fraud. If you can show that the county records were manipulated to create the appearance of lawful approval, you can trigger criminal investigations that have teeth beyond a civil suit. When I read that email thread into the radio mic, the town's chatter changed. People who'd been quietly complicit started to cough. Our allies multiplied. A younger reporter from a regional paper smelled the story. She had a Keurig and an apologetic laugh and an appetite for scandal. She asked questions that made boilerplate answers crumble. A county supervisor, sister to a woman who lived down the lane from me, called and said, "If you have proof that records were altered, file it. I'll take it higher." The sheriff, who had once stood on my porch with the eviction notice, started avoiding Richard's eye at public events. People are not brave because they like risk. They are brave because the cost of staying quiet grows. We filed a complaint with the county prosecutor. We put the forged permit, the altered minutes, and the email thread into an exhibit notebook and handed it to someone trained to read patterns. The prosecutor called us in and read the documents like someone reading a story that had been badly edited. He said, "This looks problematic." That was the kind of sentence you hope for when you need the machinery of law to bite where it hurts. We also filed an injunction to halt construction pending a full hearing, and the court, to their credit, issued a temporary stay. It felt like a small miracle, like the sluice gate holding back water for another day. Another legal fact: many states allow for an injunction to stop construction when there is credible evidence that permits were fraudulently obtained or that due process was not followed. An injunction is not a finding of final guilt, but it is a freeze. Time enough to walk a case into the light. When the judge signed the temporary restraining order, the sound in the courthouse was a paper whisper. People hugged like it was a victory, though none of us knew the shape of the end, but they escalated. The Developers Council accused us of market sabotage and threatened countersuits. They hired a forensic handwriting analyst in a bid to discredit our claim about the forged signature. A smear piece appeared in a neighboring town's weekly, filled with thin accusations aimed at me. Resident agitator, antiquated property owner, obstructionist. It read like a grocery list of insults. The smell of frying oil rose in my kitchen as my neighbor made lunch and flipped pancakes, and for a moment I felt ridiculous for being so stirred by ink on paper. Then a man in a suit called with threats of fees that would bankrupt the average homeowner. The edges of the fight had sharpened. We found another lever: water. The county code had a clause, rarely used, dusty but clear, that said any alteration of natural drainage that causes increased downstream flooding without permit could be halted and reversed. Maria traced the new pipes and found they redirected runoff toward a protected wetland. The water lines were wrong. The dickering over fences suddenly included the language of environmental compliance. We notified the environmental agency and provided photos. The smell of wet soil and crushed sedge rose in the emails and in the filings. There's something about naming a natural law, water runs downhill, that makes bureaucrats sit up. Knowledge. Bombs kept landing when tension was highest. At the moment when the developer tried to paint the injunction as a nuisance, I dropped another. Recorded easements and deed restrictions trump informal agreements. A recorded easement from the early 20th century may still bind present-day owners, especially if it was never legally abandoned. That sentence landed with a small metallic sound in the courtroom. People in the gallery shifted. This is not arcane detail. It's the fulcrum on which the entire conflict balanced. If a century-old easement ran through the new lots and was never lawfully extinguished, those lots were built illegally. They tried to frighten us with litigation. Their lead lawyer had the kind of accent that made every phrase sound like a verdict. He spoke slowly, like a man with a metronome in his chest. He hinted at bankruptcy and endless appeals. He played smear campaigns and hired a private security firm that made us feel watched at night. Children would point and say, "Why is that man watching us?" The security guards smelled of sunscreen and expensive vault-like cologne. The town's nights felt like a play where the lead actor had convinced everyone the set was the whole world. But then Richard cracked in a small public way that felt like a fracture. A video surfaced of him at a council dinner, his hand trembling as he reached for his water glass. Someone edited the footage and posted it. The clip spread like a stain. People began to whisper about his health, about stress, and about desperation. I don't love that we used a man's weakness, but politics is not a gentleman's game. And when someone weaponizes a neighborhood for private gain, their human frailties become relevant. The vulnerability pushed a few of his allies to distance themselves. A once solid vote slipped. Loyalty, it seems, is conditional. They tried one last gambit. Propose a settlement that would give them legal cover and pay off Richard's debt by declaring the new land a community expansion and transferring a slice of common land. They sent their attorney to my house with a pen and a glossy brochure, and the lawyer's pen hovered over a signature line like a vulture over a lamb. The air in my living room turned metallic, like the toilet tank in an old house. He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. He offered us the community fund and a promise of future improvements. It smelled like a bribe dressed up as benevolence. At that moment, cameras from 3 outlets showed up outside my window, and the light refracted across their lenses like a carnival. People gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the idea of a story where small-town David might actually unseat a Goliath. The reporter with the Keurig packed her recorder and gave me a look that said, quietly, "You ready?" I remember the taste. Of coffee again, bitter and honest. We had made them bleed paper, yes, but bleeding paper is messy and it hurts. It's not a quick kill. The developer threatened countersuits. Richard's debts pressured him into desperate measures, and the town's faith in its institutions was fraying along the seams. The judge's calendar for the permanent injunction was set for a month, out. The prosecutor hinted at an inquiry but required more time. The press circled. Our community mobilized, but the opposition had resources. "What would you have done?" I asked in a live interview, and the reply cascade was immediate. Hundreds of comments, some angry, some hopeful, some unimaginably reckless. The engagement was our oxygen. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. We needed the algorithm as much as we needed the law. Both would carry our voice farther than the courthouse could. The county. Prosecutor called a press conference, and, in the same week, the developer announced a counter-motion to dissolve the injunction. Cameras flashed. The lawyer's pen, the same one offered for signatures and sealed deals, hovered on a different table now near the courthouse steps. In the crowd, a man who had once brought me eggs whispered, "This could go either way." The camera focused on his hands, and I saw the tremor that comes with a town holding its breath. We'd already seen the first moves, the player cards laid on the table. Now the court clock started ticking in ways that made the town feel like a drum. The middle of the story was now the sharpest point. Will the law hold, or will money buy silence? The answer was not yet clear. The ink was not yet dry. A lawyer's pen suspended over a sheet that could change everything. And behind him, my face on camera, steady and tired, as the shutter clicks and the town waits for the judge to speak. The courtroom smelled like dry paper and old coffee, a low courthouse kind of hunger. The judge's robe folded over him like a dark flag. He tapped his gavel and the sound landed like a punctuation mark in my chest. Cameras leaned forward like vultures. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table with his hands clasped, his left thumb stuttering against the knuckle of his index finger, that same tremor I'd seen in the dinner footage. He kept touching the cufflink on his sleeve as if it were something he could polish into courage. The prosecutor's eyes were steady. The developer's lawyer arranged his pens like a neat little accusation. Outside the windows, had I the mind to look, the sluice gate would be humming under a thin afternoon sun. The smell of melted butter from the courthouse vending machine mingled oddly with the metallic tang of the evidence folders. If you believe. No one is above the law. Hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. I sat at the defense table with a binder that felt heavy like a promise. Inside it were 1, the 1905 covenant, browned at the edges and folded like a relic; 2, the enlarged signature side by side with the forged affidavit; 3, emails that smelled of server dust and scandal; and 4, a little USB labeled minutes. The one that held the recording of the junior clerk saying they filed minutes after the fact. The judge flicked his eyes to the clerk's testimony and then to the prosecutor. He nodded once, small and grave, like a man closing a trap. We opened with testimony from the county clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a liveliness that had been dulled by subpoenas. When she took the stand, the courtroom tightened. She explained what proper minutes should look like and how unusual it would be to file them retroactively. Her voice was small, and the sound of her breathing between sentences was the sound of someone unspooling a lie they'd been taught to tell. Maria sat beside me and held my hand for a moment, the pressure like an anchor. The smell of her motor, oil-stained jacket, and the warmth of her palm were simple human details in a room full of legal coldness. Then we played the clerk's recorded call. Her voice on the tape was younger, an apologetic tremor she'd never wanted to be part of. "We just filed them to match what happened," she said. The room went quiet enough to hear the hum of the air conditioner. The prosecutor's pen paused. The tape was a small, brutal thing, a legal fact wrapped in a human mistake. You can listen to someone confess to bending procedure, and the confession carries the weight of an exposed rib. Paper crumples. People confess. Power wobbles. Knowledge bomb one landed during the cross-examination like a thrown brick. I said it plain into the mic because facts are weapons when properly sharpened. If a homeowners association fails to comply with its own amendment procedures, or if minutes are fabricated to manufacture a supermajority vote, those actions can render the association's purported approvals void and may expose responsible parties to civil and criminal liability for fraud. The judge's eyebrows rose. The prosecutor looked at the judge and then at the developer's counsel. The developer's lawyer swallowed. That legal fact moved from abstract to urgent in the space of a breath. Microphones caught the small rustle of pages as everyone looked for a way to breathe around it. Richard tried to stand, to claw back the narrative, but his answers came out thin. He defended the new houses like a general reciting a rehearsed speech. "We acted in the community's best interest," he said, and the phrase tasted like lemon, oil, and varnish. The prosecutor asked about transfers of funds. Maria's evidence of payments from the HOA account to a mortgage company linked to the developer was placed in front of him like a mirror. He touched his left hand then as if to steady the tremor. A silence fell, full and heavy. the kind that wants to be filled with some small, false explanation. He offered none that held. We had more. Baxter took the stand and, with his survey map spread like a story, traced the carriage easement recorded. In 1912, that ran straight through the newly filled lots. He pointed with fingers that smelled faintly of dust and metal. "This carriage path," he said, and the court mapped the line in its head, because you can always see a line drawn across a map and understand how it divides truth from fiction. Baxter's theodolite printouts made the developer's permits look like graffiti over an old law. The gallery breathed again. Knowledge bomb 2 hit when the county environmental specialist testified about redirected drainage. She laid a photo on the evidence table, and the image bloomed on the screen. The new piping leading runoff toward a protected wetland. She described how unauthorized alteration of natural drainage is subject to immediate corrective orders and civil penalties under environmental code. The words landed like a slap. The judge blinked. The developer's lawyer argued technicalities, but the specialist's voice had the calm certitude of someone who has watched water do what water always does: find its level, eat what obstructs it. The smell of river mud seemed to rise from the screen itself. The injunction, our temporary reprieve, took on the teeth of law. We called the junior clerk. She stood under oath and looked like a person who had been caught carrying ash. She explained, halting, then steadier, how she had been pressured to clean up the paperwork. Her explanation was a small, devastating lattice of pressure and fear. A whisper here, a promise there, a crooked signature smoothed over. The prosecutor leaned in then, asking pointed questions about who directed what. Names surfaced. A pattern emerged like veins in marble. The gallery rustled. The developer's counsel made a note, then another, like someone trying to rearrange the facts into a less damning shape. Then came the handwriting expert. He displayed the forged affidavit under magnification. Strokes where my grandfather's hand would have hesitated, a pressure where my grandfather's pen would have lightened. The expert spoke of microstrokes and ink pooling and the biometric signatures of a hand. You don't need to be an archivist to see when something pretends to be old. You only need to know how to hold it up to light. The court watched the magnified letters and the fake seal under a lamp and understood the quiet violence of forgery. Richard's eyes moved like someone watching a house burn from the inside. The smell in the room had shifted to something acrid and electric, I testified. I told the story of the dam and the first truck, of the orange flags, and of the night I'd opened the sluice gate. How the sound of the water had been a literal and symbolic clearing of lies. The prosecutor asked about my discovery of the forged permit and the email thread. My voice did not wobble. I told them about the smell of toner, the crinkle of thermal paper, the taste of coffee during long nights. You learn to make details matter in a courtroom because jurors remember a smell more readily than a clause. I watched Richard's face shrink with each memory. It felt like a kind of justice, even before the law had spoken. Outside the courthouse. Doors, the town was a jitter of voices, the smell of hot asphalt and exhaust and conspiracy. People lined up with signs, some calling for justice, others for calm. Reporters darted and pivoted. Lila handed out hand-sewn flyers. Her hands smelled faintly of cinnamon from the pies she still made when the world felt like it might fall apart. The sense of community was tangible, hands gripping signs, dogs pulling at leashes, children craning to see the lawyers like a new kind of theater. This was not the destruction of a town. It was its reassembly around truth. The prosecutor put the forged permit on the table, and the county records expert explained how official seals were supposed to be affixed and archived. The expert pointed out discrepancies in the timeline of when documents appeared relative to the alleged votes. He said something quietly enormous. Altering official county records to justify construction can be criminal fraud and is grounds for revocation of permits and restitution. The judge's pen stopped. A courtroom hush shifted into a focused, mechanical sound. Pens on paper, shutters snapping, the breath between sentences. The smell of printer ink seemed to come off the exhibit like a confession. That legal fact tightened the noose. Fraud, not merely a civil wrong. When the developer tried to counter, their witnesses were thin reeds. Their forensic handwriting analyst, paid to rebut, instead admitted limits when shown the magnified strokes. The email server logs placed one of their employees in the chain, asking for expedited action. Under oath, the employee suggested, awkwardly, that someone in the HOA had guided the process. Names tumbled. The veneer of a well-oiled operation showed its bolts. Richard's weakness unfolded in public. Under cross, he admitted to approving expedited filings without personally reviewing documentation. He claimed he trusted the clerk. The tremor in his left hand made a brief, involuntary punctuation between lies. Someone in the gallery whispered about mortgages. A political ally of his tried to speak, but the microphone swallowed the words. The prosecutor leaned back and smiled with a quiet ferocity. It was a smile that said, "We have you where the light shines." We had prepared for this, but the prosecutor had a final surgical move. He asked the court to consider the equitable remedy of dissolving the HOA's authority over the contested land, or, in the alternative, appointing a receiver to manage the HOA's finances and operations pending resolution, given the evidence of fraudulent activity and self-dealing. He outlined precedents, not in statutory citation, because each state varies, but in principle. When an HOA acts outside its authority, with forged records and self-dealing leadership, a court has the power to unwind those actions, appoint a receiver, and in extreme cases, nullify the association's corporate actions affecting property rights. The judge listened. The air in the room carried the white scent of paper and the copper tinge of something close to a verdict. Knowledge bomb. 3 landed with the force of a hammer. HOAs can be dissolved or have their corporate powers curtailed through judicial action where there is evidence of fraud, mismanagement, or acting beyond statutory authority. Homeowners can petition courts for receivership or dissolution, and courts can void improperly recorded amendments or transfers if they are shown to be procured by fraud. That line was the legal sharpness that turned our tactical patience into a decisive edge. The judge tilted his head. The developer's counsel looked for refuge in procedural complexity and found none that stuck. Outside, the dam's voice carried faintly. The sluice gate humming, a sound that had become a private metronome during the months of fight. I walked the courthouse steps and felt the sun on my neck like a reward. People came up to me with tears and old recipes and small conspiratorial grins. Harold, who once bought eggs from me, gripped my arm and said, "You did good." The smell of his breath was coffee and sincerity. The sense of being seen was intoxicating and terrifying. The judge's decision came 2 weeks later, and when he read it, the room felt like a contained sea. He annulled the approvals for the 50 homes, finding that material records had been altered and that the HOA's leadership had engaged in self-dealing with ties to the developer. He ordered restitution where appropriate, required the appointment of an independent receiver to oversee the HOA's finances, and recommended criminal referral for investigation into the forged permits. The gavel's fall was a final, clean sound. People wept quietly. Lila's hand found mine. The room smelled of lemon oil no more. Now it smelled like basil and open windows. Richard left the courthouse looking like a man whose scaffolding had been removed. His allies melted away. The developer announced a pause on construction and later filed for bankruptcy protection, a paper defense against a town's anger. The county launched a criminal inquiry. The sheriff, who once nailed an eviction notice to my door with the sheepishness of someone following orders, apologized publicly in a short, rough statement that tasted of humility and the thin air of, "A man righted. We held a town meeting after the ruling. People came wrapped in sweater coats and the smell of fall and the sound of a chorus that had learned new harmonies. We planted new trees where the bulldozer's tracks had laid scars. The dam that had been my small act of defiance became a symbol, not a weapon. We repaired its sluice, drafted a community stewardship plan, and taught kids how to measure water flow. The air smelled like wet earth and possibility. The taste of Lila's pie at the picnic afterward was a ceremonial sweetness. Full circle came when the final document was recorded. The HOA board, under court supervision, passed a motion to rescind the contested approvals and to enact stricter transparency measures, including public posting of minutes and a requirement that any financial transfers over a threshold be subject to independent audit. The man-made empire Richard had built, illusion and intimidation, unraveled into an accounting ledger. The townspeople demanded safeguards. The court's receiver instituted them. Justice, as measured by paper and procedure, had its day. There was a personal payback moment I won't forget. In a quiet hearing, the forgery was formally entered into the record as evidence, and a retired judge, whom I once helped by bringing a file he'd lost in the archives, read aloud the fibrous, faded 1905 covenant that had started it all. As his voice filled the room, the edges of the old map seemed to assert themselves back into life. The image in my head was simple and thumbnail perfect. The judge reading, my hand on the old survey. Richard's mouth a thin line. That single frame would go on to be shared across feeds, and I watched it travel the way a quiet truth moves. We rebuilt in better ways. The 50 lots were eventually sold back to conservation groups or reparceled under strict oversight. Community gardens grew where foundations had nearly been poured. People who'd been cowed spoke in public and learned to read minutes. The sheriff instituted training on civil rights and community policing. The county clerk's office rewrote its protocols to require double verification for expedited filings. Small changes, yes, but they stacked. The smell of newly turned soil became a town's scent of healing. At the end, I went back to the sluice gate and let the water run for no other reason than to hear a sound I associate with doing the right thing. The chain was warm from the sun, and the metal hummed. The taste of the victory was not sweet but steady, like black coffee with a slice of lemon. I stood there and thought about how easily towns are bought if people don't read the fine print. I thought about the prosecutor who had taken our messy evidence and made it a clean case, about Maria's grease-stained hands and Baxter's old theodolite, about Lila's pies and Harold's eggs. I thought about the clerk who had told the truth at last. Justice had been messy. It had not been swift. It had been the product of patience, proof, and a town that finally decided not to look away. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far HOA power reaches. If your HOA ever crossed a line, tell me below. Your story might be the next one we expose. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to hear this. The more people know, the harder it is for HOAs to get away with this. We left the courtroom with new policies and old wounds, but mostly with a sense that power, when exposed, becomes accountable. The town smelled like rain and repair. People hugged and then went home to fix porches and paint fences and replant apple trees. Children ran through the park we had reclaimed, their laughter a small, persistent kind of victory. The last frame I carry is of Lila placing a hand on the 1905 covenant, her fingertips tracing lines that had once been used to divide. She smiled, small and triumphant, and said, "We did what they said couldn't be done." The ending is not a fairy tale. Bad men get creative. Systems get rigged. But truth, stacked with patience and the right legal facts, can act like water. Find the cracks, widen them, and let gravity do the rest. If you want another insane HOA takedown, click here. You won't believe what happened next. If your story could be next, comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. Justice in our town wasn't a single thunderbolt. It was a series of small, loud acts that together made a storm. We opened a sluice gate and watched a whole empire wash away.